The purpose of this video will be to discuss socialism in the context of Marxism and then of Leninism. Hopefully the outcome of this video will be a strong enough understanding of Marxism and Leninism so that we can talk about some of the differences between them, and also so that we'll be prepared to think about how Leninism is imposed in Russia in 1917 and following during the Russian Civil War, and then ultimately so that later we'll be able to compare Leninism or Marxist Leninism with Stalinism. So this isn't a video that's intended to be a full overview of socialism or even a full overview of communism in general. And even though at the beginning I'll try to talk about pre-Marxian socialism, I think that it's important to note that I'll leave out some really key figures like Saint-Simon and Hobson, who would be really worth looking at. Saint-Simon, if we were really going to understand pre-Marxian socialism, and Hobson, if we were really going to understand the origins of some of Lenin's thought. But just to keep things simple, I'll focus just on Marxism and Leninism after I give a quick check-in about what pre-Marxian socialism must be. And, as you may have noticed, I'm leaving Friedrich Engels out of this in general, although most of what I'll talk about in terms of Marxism is connected with the Communist Manifesto, which was also written by Friedrich Engels. I think if we think of the Communist Manifesto as the beginning of Marxist published thought, we wouldn't be far wrong in that. And so if we think about what socialism meant pre-1948, we can classify it probably as what Marx and Engels would have classified as utopian socialism. And this is the idea that society could be improved through the centralized control of the productive forces. And so that's what, in a very rough outline, that's what pre-Marxian socialists were advocating for. Marx and Engels, when they write the Communist Manifesto, they have some more specific points that they're trying to bring across. First of all, they're looking at this through a historical perspective, very clearly through a historical perspective. And their view of history emphasizes the primacy of social arrangements in history. And they believe that the social arrangements in history are created through material relationships, your relationships to the materials that humans use to survive. Famously, Marx and Engels claim that the history up until this point has been a history of class struggles, of one group of people struggling against another group of people, and that struggle is caused by their antagonistic relationship to the material that's used to produce things. Marx and Engels claimed that the current age, the middle of the 19th century, was dominated by the bourgeoisie, and that the bourgeoisie had come into their position of dominance during the French Revolution, when the old dominant class, the feudal noblemen, were overthrown by the rising bourgeoisie, or the capitalists, people who invest money and use it to create more capital. You buy something for $10, you then figure out a way to sell it for $15, you've made $5 of profit. That's an example of a way that the bourgeois merchant would make money. So the current age is the age of the dominance of the bourgeoisie to Marx and to Engels. And they have but one antagonistic class, which are the people who work for them, whose labor they exploit. And these people are called the proletariat. In this current age of capitalism, which is dominated by the bourgeoisie has, through exploiting the proletariat, been able to harness the greatest productive forces that have ever been known. But bourgeois dominance rests upon its ability to exploit the proletariat and, in fact, to drive more and more people in society into an alienated role with regard to the means of production. An example of this might be a shoemaker. Shoemaker is a common example that teachers use in this position. In the old feudal days, the shoemaker was a master craftsman. He studied for years under another master shoemaker and then finally got to set up his own shop, and then he made shoes and he sold those shoes. In a bourgeois productive model, there is no master shoemaker. There is a shoe factory. And the bourgeois industrialists own the factory and they bring in workers, usually very low-skilled workers, where no worker himself is able to make a whole shoe, but just to make a part of a shoe. So we go from having the shoemaker own his own shop and own his own tools to a shoemaker who can't even make a shoe, just can make the sole of a shoe or the laces of a shoe, and who doesn't own any of the means that are being used to produce this. And that would be a proletariat shoemaker. So the bourgeoisie are creating more and more proletariat. And the proletariat class is the antagonistic class to the bourgeoisie. And so for the first time then, we have the master class creating the very class which will overthrow it. Now, historical forces, according to Marx and Engels, will require the victory of the proletariat and the creation of a communist government that will eliminate all of this bourgeois property. This is inevitable, according to the Communist Manifesto. As the workers become more and more oppressed, they will get greater and greater class consciousness. At first, they will come together and they will form trade unions, in Portuguese, sindicatos. But this will only work for a time, because ultimately, the bourgeoisie will use their political power to break the power of the unions. Time and again, violence will break out in the streets. But again, the bourgeoisie will be able to use their political power and the power of the police and the army to suppress these uprisings. But eventually, when the class consciousness becomes so great and the number of bourgeoisie becomes so small as all of the capital and power is concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer and fewer families, then eventually the proletariat will be so large that it will no longer be able to be restrained by the police or the army, and the proletariat will overthrow the bourgeoisie, and then will institute a new form of government where bourgeois property, the stuff we use to make stuff, is no longer in the hands of individuals, but is in the hands of the state. And then we can move into a rational form of production, which will actually reduce the amount of work that's needed from everyone. Because taking advantage of all of the technological achievements of capitalism, the proletariat will be able to produce much more than they were before, because nobody's stealing off the profit from the top. So there'll be less work, but there'll still be plenty. And this is the sort of idealized form of communism that Marx and Engels seemed to imagine. Now, Lenin, on the other hand, had a couple of additions to this. And of course, he was doing his writing, between 50 and 70 years after Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. But his disagreements weren't just temporal. He was also shaped by the fact that he was living in Russia and was a member of the Russian Communist Party. But one of the key ideas that Lenin came forward with was that class consciousness, naturally occurring class consciousness, is insufficient to transcend the period of trade unionization. Because trade unionization, instead of actually setting up an antagonism between workers and the owners, helps to accommodate workers to the capitalist system. It allows them to have slightly higher wages, but it doesn't make them opposed to wages in general, according to Lenin. Therefore, Lenin said that there needs to be an advanced guard, a tip of the proletariat spear, or what we might call a vanguard. And this vanguard must be the Communist Party. You need to have a Communist Party that can educate the workers beyond trade unionism, show them their potential power, and ultimately organize the revolution. So whereas Marx and Engels spoke of a naturally occurring, inevitable revolution of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, Lenin believed that this needed help. It needed to be spurred along. In a chemical metaphor, we could say that it needed a catalyst for this reaction to occur. And Lenin believed that he and his fellow communists were that natural spark which would cause what he hoped to be a chain reaction. The more advanced the productive forces are in a country, according to Marx and according to Engels, the more likely it is that that country will have a communist revolution. Russia was definitely not the most advanced capitalist country in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. It was therefore an unlikely place for the communist revolution to begin. But Lenin was able to solve this problem because if what was needed was a spark, and if that spark could come from a group of highly dedicated revolutionaries instead of from a mass movement of workers, the spark could start in Russia and then could spread throughout Europe to much more industrialized countries such as Germany or France. Lenin also had the insight that capitalism extends itself through imperialism. That imperialism allows capitalists in highly industrialized countries not just to export their goods to other countries, but ultimately to export their capital, to export their money to other countries, to invest their profits, not in their home country of England or of Germany, but to invest their profits in colonies or in their empires abroad. And in this sense, there's a way in which the proletariat itself can be exported, where the workers and the manufacturers might be doing the work in India, but the owners are in England. Furthermore, this will lead to competition between the most industrialized countries on Earth. And this competition will lead to conflict, as there are fewer and fewer, not just natural resources, not just workers, but also fewer and fewer areas for profitable investment. And this will lead countries to go to war for imperialistic reasons. And this is exactly how Lenin saw the First World War. And so, the First World War did two things for Lenin. It definitely reaffirmed for him the idea that imperialism was the highest form of capitalism, and that in fact was the title of a pamphlet that he published in 1917. It also showed him that governments were capable of hyper-rationalizing their economies in a way that would exactly lend itself to socialism. And so, this hyper-rationalization of the economy, even in Russia, made Lenin believe that it would be possible to move directly from the feudal state of Russia to the communist state, skipping the bourgeois revolution, which, for example, had taken place in France, and which had never taken hold in Russia. So, on the one hand, we have a situation where Lenin believes that the war has made Russia more prepared for communism because it's rationalized their forms of production. On the other hand, he believes that the war has turned many more Russians into members of the proletariat than existed before. And the reason he says this is because he says that the proletariat is also composed of soldiers. Because what are soldiers but people who have to sell their work for labor and who have to maybe sell their lives as labor for a wage, which they're paid by the government each month. So therefore, even though Russia had very few industrial workers as a percentage of the population compared with something like Germany, most of the army was made up of peasants. And these peasants, therefore, had been proletarianized by the war. So, because of this, Lenin argued that Russia could lead an international revolution because it has a vanguard party that's been ruthlessly suppressed by the Tsar and therefore is ready to lead the violent revolution that's necessary, and because its peasants have gained this class consciousness. And so Lenin and his party, the Bolsheviks, believed that they could be the spark which would light the revolution that would then spread throughout Europe. So that it would start in Russia and then could quickly spread through the soldiers fighting on the battlefields to the Germans, to the Austro-Hungarians, and so on. Now, Lenin is obviously a product of his time and his place. He's very connected with the significance of the First World War, and he is not in any way alone in thinking that the First World War was a significant world-changing event. He's also a product of his place. Leninism has been seen by some as an excuse for leading a communist revolution in Russia, which wouldn't have made a lot of sense if you asked Marx or Engels if they thought Russia was a good place for the revolution to occur. So these are the key distinctions then between Marxism and Leninism. And I hope that they'll be helpful for you as you engage in your study of the Russian Civil War and we look at the way that Lenin and the Bolsheviks tried to put into practice his beliefs about the true path of communism.